Yeah, I got asked to explain how I first came to the Territory, which was as an inaugural linguist, a beginner. I started off the Katherine Regional Aboriginal Language Centre, which became called Diwuru, which was a mixture of language words on the east side and the west side. It was started off because when people were consulting about an arts and a crafts centre for Katherine, many old people in particular mentioned language, and they wanted there to be an organisation that, I suppose, looked after language. When I first came up, I suppose it was that vague, it looked after language, and with our committee we sorted out some of the things that would involve. At first, our committee, which changed each year, would have only thought about traditional languages, those being probably the subject of so much heartfelt angst about who was learning what and whether or not that language would be preserved. Over time, as we saw that so many young people were speaking Creole and that this wasn't acknowledged in the schooling system, really, then we started having these conversations with the committee, and eventually Creole was added to the languages that the Aboriginal Language Centre had looked after, and we started off doing, we had the first interpreting course in Creole in the Territory, and a number of other things. So yeah, sort of, yeah. Bit odd, but anyhow, if it's of interest, there you go. Okay. What's the title again? Oh, so we're talking, just got a bit muddled up with the workshop. Teaching in linguistically complex and dynamic classrooms. That's a mouthful, isn't it? And yet, if you're a teacher, that's what you do in the Northern Territory, and plenty of other places too. Okay. We have a bit of a mantra. That's a saying that we try and judge how we're doing things, which is recognising, respecting and responding. We don't want to just get caught with recognising. Valuing is good, but sometimes it doesn't turn into action. We also want to put the obligation on ourselves. If we can see a situation, how are we responding? So we have, all of us, and in Queensland too, complex and dynamic language ecologies that we have to recognise in order to respect and in order to respond. We have to recognise that our students are not just speaking one language by the time they leave school, but more than one in varying degrees. So they're multilingual learning. We have to recognise that that's what's going on and respect that fact, and you do that by responding in some way to support that. And obviously we have to recognise that we need language teaching components in our teacher toolkits. In our workshops we've been talking a lot about those teacher toolkits. Again in our workshops, which I think all of you would have seen now, we're saying really that means how does that target language, the vehicle for the learning, how does it work? Can we, in terms of our responses, identify this language node on top of all the learning and concepts we want to have happen? Can we plan and teach it? And you know, do we understand how second language trajectories, it's like a road, how does that work? These are the things that are in the language teaching components that we need. So, to the topic then, what do we actually mean by linguistically complex and dynamic classrooms? And here's, we hope, possibly some answers to questions that have been asked here of ourselves or to the group, as well as from all of the workshops that we do, the sorts of questions that we usually get back. So we're hoping it might be a bit useful. So we want to talk about this idea of complex and dynamic by saying what kinds of languages have we got, what are the ecologies in the speech communities our students come from, what are the repertoires of individuals, and what actually happens in classrooms. So that's our first bit, because if we can't see this or have some insight into it, then how do we do the respect and respond bit? Okay. So if you think about kinds of languages, as you'll know from the workshop, where we had our three-way strong as muscles. We think there's sort of three strands of languages to pay attention to. Traditional languages, contact languages and dialects. Note the blue, and I'll discuss that in a bit. And let's say Englishes, just for starters. Okay? Now, if we think about this, we might say, well, there is at least 200, or there were at least 200 really distinct traditional languages. So by me sort of popping them in a little red box there, I'm not trying to say there's just one. I mean, that's one kind of language. In Australia, through invasion and colonisation of an English-speaking majority, we have caused English lexified creoles. That means words historically of English origin are put together with different sound systems, different grammatical structures, different meanings, different usages interpersonally, and different cultural kind of understandings and ways of using language. So although there's at a surface level something that all English speakers might eventually recognise sounds a bit like English, it's, when you look at it, very, very different. As well as that, we have, and I'm just calling it Englishes at the moment, because I want to talk about what creoles and dialects might be then. All of this, as we've been discussing so often, is a bit of a blurry kind of thing. Nobody has a magic wand to say automatically, this is a dialect, this is a creole, this is a this. But there's sort of some rules of thumb, and I want to talk about the ways that we might think about these kind of languages. Because traditional languages, in terms of place and people, we would say, well, they are the original languages. Sure, they change, but they were here before invasion and colonisation of English speakers. They were here before, if you're on the north, you know, the Macassans, they belong here with the people from here. Contact languages, well, they're spoken in places as well, but it's not in the same way as traditional languages. Englishes also have places and people. The history and process helps us sort out contact languages from traditional languages, because it was language contact that has caused them. We often need an idea of the comprehensibility, that means understanding on both sides, to start separating the idea of language and dialect. Because the general idea is that a dialect, or dialects, are mutually comprehensible. That means if you speak this one and you speak this one, it makes sense. But you've been hearing a whole heap of things that says it's not quite that simple. Why is that so? Well, because the difference between creoles, say, and dialects of English, I sort of use Englishes here just to sort of include a lot of things, is that the Aboriginal English, or is, depending on what you apply that term to, at a surface level, might look almost exactly the same as English. And you've heard people who class themselves as Aboriginal English speakers here saying, you know, it was sort of the same, but sort of not, it wasn't clear. Sometimes, at a surface level, those forms are the same. So they're talking about, and you need to talk more to people who, you know, have Aboriginal English, all of us do, to find out their exact experience. But sometimes at a surface level, people are talking about something that really has almost exactly the same forms. But the ways, the meanings, the life experiences that attend to that are quite different. Sometimes, and you would have seen, say, in Professor Ian Malcolm's talk, sometimes those forms differ in really observable ways from, say, standard Australian English. So we use that term a bit as an umbrella for a range of things. Technically, if you could get exact at all, it would be dialects are meant to be mutually comprehensible, the forms are roughly the same, we can work maybe on the meanings together with respect, you know, on both sides. Technically, creoles would be something at a surface level, even though you can see there's a relationship and overlap historically with English, all the connecting in the endings and stuff, you can see lots of stuff that's very different. So that's sort of technically, but it's rather difficult to operationalise, so to speak. There's sort of this idea, but how does it work out? The most important thing probably is, since we're teachers here and we're talking about classrooms, is the teaching ramifications. Because if you've been to our workshops, I've mentioned a few times, language awareness, as presented, say, in Felix or Making the Jump, or critical language awareness, according to Jeff Siegel, it's really for things that have some overlap with the target language. So things, in our context, language varieties that are being caused by language contact. Why? Because the presence of stuff, I keep using these words, stuff. The presence of stuff is so erudite, isn't it? The presence of material that gives people clues, if they speak English, that this might mean this, or in English, if they speak, say, Creole, that this might mean this, these clue kind of things, this overlap, that needs to be addressed. So one teaching ramification would be for these things that we have to, as teachers and students and community, work together to understand what's going on and how Creole doesn't give you automatic access to English, English to Creole. And the language awareness strategies, they help. Why? It makes it easier to pull apart, to discuss differences, to value things, to raise prestige, those kinds of things. Okay. One more thing. Between traditional and English lexified, if we're thinking about the history and the places and the people, you've heard today from Annette about light Walbury, which is a large part of, or has a large amount of, recognisably Walbury material that is used in a systematic way with Creole, K-R-I-O-L, recognisably Creole things. And you saw that storybook. There's another kind that's been identified, Gurindji Creole, which again, it's systematic. You can say on the nouns pretty much, it's got Gurindji, traditional language thing, marking, and on the verbs pretty much, that's kind of more Creole-like. That makes it sound something like you get a bit of this, a bit of that, and stir it up. I don't mean that at all. I mean, there's contact languages up this end of my colourful spectrum, as well as that end. So teaching ramifications, anything that looks a bit like English, you've got to sort out a bit. You've got to have a process, some strategy. We call it language awareness, usually. And if your surface forms are, for an English speaker, almost exactly the same, which can happen with a dialect, not all, I'm not trying to say that, which is why I've drawn those funny little boxes there, but some, then that means there can still be barriers to learning using this language because it's not being used the same way. However, for teaching strategies, what that means is you don't have to bang on about little S's or little, ED endings, or you don't have to teach the form. What you're looking for in your teaching is something else. Okay. Videos? Yes. What a good idea. Okay, just so that we're very clear about what we're talking about here, we thought we might sort of leap out of the territory just for a little bit and leap up to the Torres Strait. Just so that you can hear a little bit of what I would call a traditional language, because I'm very conscious of how powerful it was when we heard samples, and also from when Samantha did as well. Everyone sort of like, sort of zeroed in and sort of really paid attention. So I just wanted to sort of make, I suppose, rather clear. Okay, we've got a small excerpt here from Saibai Island, which is way up the top of the Torres Strait, where by and large many children are still learning Kalakaua, which is a traditional language. So I thought you'd like to hear it, it's kind of fun. And I want you to listen, because even in traditional languages, any language, you're changing all the time. And there's some things, as you hear Mr. Jeff Wire speaking, you'll hear there's some things that if you speak English, you'll be able to spot. So I want you to listen for what they are, which English kind of things are in there, and also what do you think he's talking about, because you're going to use those clues to construct a bit of meaning out of it.
My 1968. Grade 8 apa na, may bawa dapat paten. I said, "Aku rapi puas, kau sesuatu, aku bukan muas ini." Mata mupai muasi di Naikala no college po patay di. Townsville po Cook University. Adelaide. Mata kina jaga kui kai di 1991 na Bamadan. Asena murapi po 5 water. Kala no kawapada po. Danle Ugar Waraber. Kala no nasi waya di na Klonkari no apa in Cairns. I call in Cairns no my jaga pagi.
Okay, first question. Which bits English, like if you have English, which I'm hoping all of you do, or otherwise my presentation is really going down a gurgler. Which English-like things did you hear? What sort of things were they? Numbers, dates, places, names, yeah? Okay, cool. So next question, what do you think he might have been talking about?
Places in travel.
Places, travel.
When he was born,
His history, so what did you say?
his life.
His life, yes.
His studies, maybe.
Yeah, because you heard the study thing, yes, I thought that might have been a bit of a giveaway to James Cook University. And the more places you knew, sort of through the Torres Strait, you would have figured out he's jumping all over these islands. You might have constructed something about, maybe he worked in different schools or, something like that. Okay, so I don't think any of us from that would assert that we spoke Kalakaua. No. If I say keep that story going, how about you guys all try that now? You've just seen a model. How about I tell you? Start here when you were born, I want your schooling history and that, go. Kalakaua. Not going to work, is it? And most people usually don't kind of confuse that bit. So a brand new teacher like me to the territory, I don't usually confuse that I speak that or, that isn't what happens. Now I'm going to give you another example. This one's of Torres Strait Creole. People call it nowadays, well, it's sort of got an own language name now, Yungplatok, which means our language, or in the old days everyone called it broken, and actually nowadays they call it that too. But calling it broken, if you're a speaker, doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. It's sort of like a pet name. But say an outsider like me, if I called it broken, I reckon that might be a little bit more problematic. So, I'd say something to you, Torres Strait Creole or Yungplatok, yeah? Okay. So listen, this is a Creole, therefore it's in Australia. It's what we call English lexified. It's words from English, historically. Doesn't mean they're the same or they mean the same. Here, hiding inside this language. They're in there. I want you to listen for whatever ones you can. We'll listen about 3 times, so it's just a really short little bit. Okay, just pop your hands up and tell me, sort of what English words you heard. Just crab. Okay, sing them out. Don't pop your hands up. Look for.
Sit them down at the fire.
Put them on. Okay, yeah, there was, yeah.
Put them on the fire.
Fire.
Sit down and put them on the fire. That's what he said. Sit down.
Sure about the sit down bit. I'll have to do again. Sorry, it might be just my memory. Yeah. Okay, but you've got the idea. You're hearing in with your English, and if you speak Creole, K-R-I-O-L, that gives you an extra idea about how this might work. And you're used to the ums and this and a few other things. You're used to having to listen in and sort of turn those sounds around a little bit and make them work. You've got a bit of an idea about what it's like, where English speakers listening in, but remember, Creole speakers do the same, listening into English and grabbing clues, what we call the overlap. Okay, so that's one kind of Creole that's been recognised in Australia. It has a name, but I have to tell you, we don't do very good at collecting information about that, say in the census. In fact, it's really ridiculous if you want to have a look. Okay, sorry. Okay, so it all has to do with naming and forms and filling out and claiming. Okay, here's a little bit from another Creole. We would call it a Creole because all the words, historically, if you look at this, I'll read it to you, you as English speakers will be picking up clues. You're going, no, I know that one. So if I say E, you go, oh yeah, that could be E. Bin, oh yeah, go, oh you think, yep, we know that one. Det, know that one. Det, egg, in that bucket, okay. It looks kind of deceptively like English, doesn't it? Or at least it sounds like it when I sort of read it out, because the spelling system's a little bit different. Although we've just invented the spelling system, not everybody writes it that way. But for each of those things, if I take one, it's different. This is the really tricky bit. E doesn't mean he. It means he, she, or it. And a lot of the time you can move in a sentence, it means him and his and her and hers and that as well. Been? Well, it sounds like been, but it isn't, because you use it everywhere, not with like, oh, I have been, like in English, it's been. Doesn't change, that's how you do one way, that's how you do past. Been, go, get, well, been, go, that doesn't work, in English I mean, because that has to be went. Or I have been going, oh dear me. Yeah, okay, it really doesn't look quite like that. You don't go, get with, you do if you're bossing someone around, sometimes when you're being rather impolite, now I think about it. Yeah, but it'd be like go and get, or, you know, I went and got, or it would be different. Yeah. Okay, so you can see what the issue is, can't you? That there's things that look like English, but they sort of trick you. And yet, they sort of give you a head start. And yet, they cause more problems. That is the situation. Okay. Remember, complex, dynamic, this is what we're trying to show. Okay, so, it's not just a simple matter of, if I pick on one language, Kalakaua or Walpri, or... The thing is that for any language, there's variation within it. Speakers who speak that full, they can do different tricks with it. They know, because they've often heard, different regional ways. In fact, Annette said, you know, from different communities, and we know. Yeah? One tribe, one language, but we can hear. So, same thing with Creole. Mulka people speak differently to Barclay people, who speak differently to Barnga people, who speak differently to Timber Creek, yeah, okay. Same thing with English, and the Englishes. The relationships between the speakers. The registers, as in, are we trying to be really polite, really sad, joking around? What our language changes. That's what a full speaker of a language does. You know, someone who's sort of like a young adult, say, has pretty good command of all of these things. And as life goes on and they have more experiences, they'll be even more sophisticated in their own language. So the way that we use language changes just within that language, and we choose the right sorts of language to do jobs. Okay, but in our setting, nobody comes with just kind of one. It just isn't really possible nowadays, is it? So so in language ecology, which is, it gets more colourful, are you impressed? Okay, so if we go somewhere where we say, like say at Lajamanu, okay, well, yeah, traditional languages, there's one main one, and there's other ones too, but one main one, and old people speak it in that strong, heavy sort of way, and younger people sort of speak it, but we do know that there's a lot of Creole, and to communicate, then often people will move over into this to do that. And English is actually a bit inescapable, given that it's at the school and on TV and things like that, but they're used in all these different ways anyhow. Same thing for a contact language situation. You don't sort of just get away with one. You might hear itsy bitsy and that's all you've heard, but you don't for very long in life. So, if we're thinking about language ecologies, it's who uses which languages, like where, for what they're talking about, and who are they talking to. And so the language ecologies of particular places, think of it as speech communities. Because sometimes we mean just one place, but just in the one place, if you're in a big place like Darwin, that changes because it's who hangs out with who. And therefore, you know, what are they using, yeah? And so the idea of a language ecology is, you know, who's hearing what language automatically, or what languages automatically? What are they likely to be surrounded by? So that means who acquires what, or sometimes who is actually taught what. Now on top of that, another source of this complex and dynamic kind of situation is, well, none of us are exactly the same. None of our lives are exactly the same. Just because I sit down and live in Katherine or you know, at Mook or at Barunga, doesn't mean that my life is the same or my language is the same as anybody else's. It's just a higher likelihood that they might be a bit the same. So, inside of each language ecology, say, if it's a strong traditional language that's being spoken, then as a first language, and just by the way, having a first language doesn't mean you only have one. I'm just being quite simple so it will fit on one slide, yeah? You might have two main first languages, but it might be this one, and for your age, you've got a full amount. And then, because you've got families outside of your community in more Creole-speaking areas, you might be getting a bit of that. And that English is a bit unavoidable anyhow, so even if you're quite young, you've probably got little ideas about it from TV and things. Here, contact situation. You might, depending on where it is, have exposure, active use, who knows, of a traditional language, or more than one, say for Europa. And again, if you're quite young and haven't yet started on, you know, an independent life in amongst standard Australian English, you might have a little bit of that anyhow. But you might have English or a dialect of it, such as Aboriginal English. And your life, as we've heard before, might involve acquiring Creole as a second language because you move or you start associating with people who speak that way. And you might also be able to gain a heritage language, or you might even be exposed to it somehow, yeah, through the people who are around you. So the individual stuff is, and this is really important, it never stays the same. It changes as our lives take us. So we're not sort of condemned with what we are born to, or gifted automatically with what we're born to. It depends where our lives take us and what our learning has been in terms of language. So, in terms of our individual repertoires, it means which languages are learned and to what degree of proficiency. You know, so for example, myself, you know, here to here, lots of English, not so much Creole, and little tiny bits of most traditional languages because they weren't spoken around me much, even though I sort of worked with them, and European languages and heritage languages to different degrees, yeah, all different, and it would change depending on what I do with my life, yeah, henceforward. Active and passive, so many people I met when I was a linguist in Catherine said, oh, I can hear that. They had really good passive, you know, understanding of that, but found, you know, kicking it off. Understand with the tame. Understand, can't say it. Yeah. Literacy. Some languages people have not had that. Although we were talking before about it's amazing what Facebook and texting have done. Okay, and domains, subject matter, and different stages of life. These things change, so these are very dynamic. Then, of course, we jump into classrooms. Oh, did we have fun with that? You know, that old spatter work, that's what I wanted by the time I got to classrooms. I wanted spatter work, you know, spatters of everything. I didn't bother with some of it, but anyhow. In this context, say, a contact one, say Creole, where out and about in the community, you hear a lot of that. Some traditional languages, not so much, but if you add a little mark, they might have a bit of airtime out there. Some English, again, it'll depend where you were and all that sort of thing. So it's just on an average kind of thing there. With all of its variation, depending on where you're from, who you're talking to, how polite, how sorry, how happy you're being, or how joking around you are being. Then we have our children who may or may not have grown up here. And I didn't even put a full class worth because my class of Year 2s was more. So they'll all have different amounts of things, depending on who's grown them up, where they've been, where they've come from, etc. The teacher, just say it's me now, jumping into, let's say, a classroom at Barunga, I would have lots of this. Maybe after a couple of months I'd have a certain amount of Creole, do not get excited, maybe even a few itsy bitsy bits of traditional language. But I would be, because my job would be to spray out curriculum content in standard Australian English. We hope that I'd be teaching some of that language and checking if people were following. But if you see that dark green line, that was for full proficiency. 2 out of that lot have got full age proficiency of standard Australian English. A few have got a bit more standard Australian English than the others, so they would be the little orange lines. Everyone else is kind of like, really kind of a bit minimal. Okay? What gets worse is that in our communicative kind of environment is that everyone me included, is probably spraying out all kinds of language that isn't exactly standard this or standard that. In our attempt to encourage our students to produce English, we are getting so much non-standard English, so much adapted Creole, and me, in my attempt to accommodate my students and meet them and try and work what they're doing, I will be doing similar things. Even if in my head I know I must be a good model of this and teach this, it's kind of natural not to just keep on talking so no one understands you. Yeah. So, that there is a bit of a picture about what we mean by linguistically complex and dynamic classrooms, okay? Now, one last bit is that we often talk about code switching, and I just need to really quickly tackle that one, because one of the dangers when we're talking, only half of you, output is a problem. If we only talk about output, we want people to code switch fluently. Sometimes we start thinking that behaviours that look like they're swapping between languages are emblematic of that, or that we're, that's what we'll teach you to do, or that's what we'll require you to do. Just be a little bit careful. It's actually that by lots of rich language teaching and lots of practice in teaching, you might, if you're really lucky, get to that point where when you're code switching means that you're going backwards and forwards with full proficiency, or as darn near to it as we can muster. Okay.
Okay, so as part of our team's work, so the Language Perspectives team, so I'm based in Queensland. We are part of the Indigenous Schooling Support Unit, and we work with schools across the state in supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander EALD learners and supporting teachers in catering for those learners in their classrooms. We have, I guess, these dot points here that you can see, and I'm mindful of the time, I won't squeeze through all of them, of the research that we have completed across the state and within schools and with teachers and within communities to allow us to pinpoint and recognise how we can be useful and most useful to schools and teachers. So we have done quite a bit of work around recognising different language varieties around Queensland, how we can grow, and we mentioned those language awareness steps and numbers in our workshop. We've spent quite a bit of time looking at that path that we can move through, as well as assessment tools, differentiating and teaching, and how we can sequence our levels and proficiency scales. Really quickly, there you go. In terms of understanding from that research what we can say and can comment on, and Denise, I'll pass, I think you're going to do this one and then I'll do the next one, or do you want me to go? In terms of school language context, this is what we know.
Yeah, what we could say. So we just chose two areas. So about school language context, we know from the research we've done, census data is unreliable, and that's being polite. School data is often inaccurate, and that's probably being rather polite as well. Shared language understandings need building. We actually can't even get to the stage of, sort of getting good, accurate pictures of everything because we can't even talk about it meaningfully. Lots of teachers are incomers and novices, so we haven't got the relationships or the goodwill or the understanding, like having heard into it yet. We've got English lexified contact notes and dialects that lack prestige, that's a fact, and that also then adds to sort of lots of trickiness around conversations. The role of languages in knowledge transfer often isn't acknowledged at all, and we've got this issue about language proficiency, not literacy or ethnicity, that isn't visible at all. So for example, ethnicity, I mean by that, say in NAPLAN reports Indigenous students, and it looks like, and it is often said that Indigenous students don't go well. It looks like we're reporting on literacy. It doesn't happen to be literacy in any other language other than standard Australian English, so we can't sort of separate these things out, they're facts, yeah?
Also, some facts that we know from our research around teacher capabilities is that there is only one, and this was as of about 2 years ago, there was only one undergraduate compulsory course around catering for EALD Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students across Australia in terms of a set core course. Often teachers are really unclear about languages that students might speak and how to value those, again because of that inaccurate data. Teachers don't often have confidence in identifying or monitoring students' proficiency in standard Australian English. Also, teachers' ability to analyse and explain how standard Australian English works can vary depending on school experiences, uni subjects, further study. That within our classrooms, and we spoke in the workshops as classroom teachers, we're bombarded, with plenty of different things, that we can have these programs and practices that favour, as Denise mentioned, either literacy over language, but also that don't take into account or support teachers in differentiating for students' language learning needs. And finally, we can have, and again it was on the slide of our workshop, when we don't have this understanding or this knowledge, those barriers you know, when we maybe see students underperforming or underachieving, we can attribute it to other effects as opposed to language difference. So that's some of, I guess, the facts that we came up with. And then in terms of how we can, again, recognise, respect and respond to this, and I was saying, you know, we're going to come around with a few kind of vocab, or we'll come back again and again through this presentation, but hopefully you can see how it's important that there's a big commitment to this learning, and I'll pass it to Denise.
Yeah, so we think that again, something that we're really mindful of is it takes time, you know, and a real lot of, we would say intellectual, professional, and social, a sense of social justice and a sense of, you know, your social purpose in your classroom with your students, your families, your communities, commitment to your learners to go through this process, because so often it's not very clear and it's not very supported really in terms of systems and prior training. So we would say that we really need this idea of working together with a vision, you know, of how we want to work our children. You know, that means with families and community, but that vision including languages. Very often it's sort of just kind of not there. We need to be thinking about how do we do this to teach age-appropriate curriculum. We don't want anything dumbed down. We want good stuff, you know, for our students. They're as bright as anybody else. So age-appropriate concepts and content. We know that one thing that will assist is by adding language teaching practices, because that's what we're talking to you about, and differentiating your existing toolkit. Teachers come with these toolkits through our practice, through everything, through talking to teachers, through Googling online and everything. But those toolkits often presuppose that we have English. You know, they're built on this as a foundation for their effectiveness. So we need to be able to differentiate, change, adjust, adapt. And the reason why we do all of that, because we're constantly reflecting, we're constantly thinking about our students' uptake of learning. That's what will drive it, because it's about meaning making ultimately.
In terms of some questions Denise mentioned, we'll frame it with questions that have either come up already in this, you know, context of 2 days here, or that we do get again and again and again, which is, you know, how can I teach, you know, my age-appropriate curriculum when I have students with, you know, variety of proficiency in Standard Australian English or in this, you know, complex linguistic and dynamic classrooms. So you'll see there, and again, we focused on this in our workshop, so I won't spend too long on this, but it's about knowing who we've got available to us and making sure that we have an idea and we plan for that language teaching. What do we want our students to do? What can they do? What's in that gap? We spoke about that gap analysis in the workshop, and then how we can use that spiral curriculum to seek to build up that language and unplugging those specific language elements to teach. So I won't spend too long on that question because we did look at that in the workshop, but this next question.
Okay, we have a lot of difficulty in it seems to be a current climate, but maybe, I don't know, maybe I just have a short memory. What's the difference between language and literacy? A lot of people ask this and find it really hard. So one way I love, because I think it's kind of quite attractive, is that literacy is a way of representing a language. It really is. Like, you know, otherwise what is it? La 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 or random letters. It doesn't make any sense. And a really lovely, colourful expression is to say that it's like a parasite. So if you think about a tick, literacy, okay, and me, a language, the tick is literacy. It sucks out my language to be literacy. Okay? If there is no language, it's a dead tick. Got it? Okay. So try that one, and we can compare notes afterwards. Okay. So first languages are learned automatically, whereas print is added. There's the odd child who magically sort of somehow gets the system, but they're very unusual people. Yeah. By and large, you learn your first languages automatically because of what you hear, and then when you go to school or when someone teaches you, you assign letters and things like that to it. Any language can be represented through print. There's often some weird things going on in terms of what can and can't. Any language can be. It just happens to be that most languages in the world haven't got that history of it. You know, it's a more recent thing. That's just it. And it also means that some languages don't have a vast canon because they haven't been written down for all this long and been used in these ways of written text. The literacy achievement, this is a dangerous one, as a goal, we want this language and learning parcelled up. And this literacy thing often hides what the students have in terms of language. So the literacy can cover it up. We do notice that a lot. And the classroom literacy practices we set and programs, they're built on the idea you've already got English. These off-the-shelf ones, definitely.
You do this one, I'll do the next one.
Okay.
Sorry.
So yeah, again, a few people have asked us, how do we actually know if a student is a learner of Standard Australian English? Well, that takes experience, time, you know, and many things. Sometimes it's obvious because we can hear that the student is speaking in a language that is so different, we would never imagine that that was English. Oftentimes though, those students have acquired some English, so we hear some English. And they might have little ways of, sort of not showing us how hard this is. So it does become quite tricky for many teachers. So we have to cultivate an awareness of local language ecologies, because that says likely, on balance, who might speak what. And students' family backgrounds, their family members. We have to really start closely focusing in, attending to the language usages that we hear. Kids talking to their brother. That didn't sound like a... Who's doing what when? We've got to learn about, as teachers, we have to learn about what is the journey, what does it look like? A lot of us don't know that by and large, if any of us get thrown into, let's pick a country, Czechoslovakia, and we're all learning it, Czech, we're all going to start off doing what learners do, which is like a word. We're not going to assemble sentences or things that come around again and again. That's just how it works. There isn't really any other way to do it. Okay. But lots of us don't know that. So when we hear single words, we don't know that that's what we're looking at, or at least that's a possibility. And finally, it's really important to have this idea of comparing, so that we're looking and saying, I taught this, I know I taught this, this one's doing that. Is that possibly a language learner feature? It's this idea of keeping a little bit of an antenna up. Who's getting what out of my teaching? Why might that be?
So in terms then, I guess, as our team, as a language perspectives team, and what our responses are to these complex language situations and what we know, we have completed quite a number of community collaborations. Part of them being a language interview project. Denise facilitated that project. I don't know if you want to talk any more, if we've got time, or just...
Lots.
Yeah.
And it's about language stories, and we've been so delighted that people have used that as curriculum content to have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's own life stories and their language life stories there, because it's a way to sort of show this is absolutely how most of our families are living. It's great.
We've also had projects which I'll show you in a moment, our vernacular language posters, where there's quite a large amount and extended time of community consultation and engagement in the putting together of these posters. Again, it's largely about that language awareness and those conversations to build ways to talk about language, to celebrate these language varieties that may not have names. Or may not have their status as attached to other languages there as well. And also an Understanding Children's Language Acquisition project. Denise mentioned earlier that's where our three-way strong kind of came as a result of that work across different schools in Queensland. Do you want to add anything more to those ones? Really quickly, in terms of teacher training, again, what we know about those facts from what our teachers bring in our work with teachers across the state is that we have kind of basic entry-level workshops, but we also know that because, as Denise mentioned, it takes time and it takes a considered kind of effort to get our heads in there, is that we do a language leader training. So we take, a semester, 30 hours of weekly, 2 hours a week, ongoing conversations to build understandings around all of these different areas, as well as schools then engaging in kind of 1 hour phone contact. So we jump on the phone and, again with many of you in lots of different centres and maybe not quite handy to town, we found that a useful way to continue these conversations and build this knowledge. We've also again, had to think about curriculum development and differentiating. So with our toolkits, again, that language toolbox of teachers often not being sufficient to support, our ELD learners in our classroom, or requiring building. In the meantime, we've had our work with the band scales and rolling that out and developing those so teachers can become familiar with those journey of learning a second language, as well as units of work and sequence language teaching and how we can look at different things. So you'll see here, Rod mentioned in his presentation earlier about language maps. Here's an example of our Cherbourg map. So you'll see here through research within the communities, the movement initially at the setup of the mission there at Cherbourg and the different language groups that were moved and represented at Cherbourg. You'll also see an example there of our vernacular language posters. So again, that opportunity to, through research and consultation within the community, to get down examples of Cherbourg talk and that contact variety spoken there. You'll see a bit of a zoom in there and a close-up look at some Cherbourg talk.
So it's a kind of more like a dialect end of things, you know, sort of about definite content variety. The posters, we can't emphasise enough that that's not something you just whip out and sort of go and ask someone to give you a bit of language. It's the consultation and it's the talk. It's about making sure that in the end, everybody feels okay that what they've got there is something that they'd be happy for teachers to understand. They might hear this walking down the street at Sherbrooke, you know, and what that means. Because remember, it's all about, it's not just having a pretty product, it means that the people who participated, all their names are around the edge, you know, they feel that this is a fair representation and they understand why and they understand the issues and how it might be used, you see? Yeah.
And so you'll just see, again, we've, for Normanton, so up in the Gulf area, Yarrabah, at the creek, again, through each of these, a name has kind of come about through that consultation. So Yarri Lingo at Yarrabah, we've got our St George poster, far southwest, and also Cunnamulla Resort, we've got a number of others, about 5 others kind of on the go at the moment also. I guess the biggest thing to kind of wrap up in terms of the learning pathways that we as teachers can need to, may need to consider and can consider is that this understanding of local language ecologies and repertoires that our students may come with, those second language acquisition pathways, as well multilingualism, and again you'll see that we spoke about in those workshops that teaching of the age level curriculum kind of subject matter, as well as identifying those language demands. Each of these things you'll see represented in that capability framework as well. It's not, Denise and I up here kind of saying, please do this and think about it. You'll see those links to that capability framework as you dig in more. And again, those considerations that we all need to have in mind in these complex language classrooms. Have you got anything else to add? That's